The café fell quiet when Yi Xiaolu laughed too loudly and her cheap handbag slipped from her arm onto the scuffed tile. A stray napkin fluttered against its worn zipper like a flag of surrender. She bent to pick it up. Two women at the next table craned their necks as if they were watching a performance. The younger woman made a soft clicking sound with her tongue. The older one's eyes flicked to the man across from Yi with the small approving nod of people who measure life in bank balances and job titles. "You're still doing that research job?" the man asked, casual but pointed. "I heard the stipend is, what, isn't it less than a barista's?" It wasn't the first time someone measured Yi by her salary. Her parents' voices, threaded with worry and the bright insistence of relatives, had nudged her into this evening. A blind date meant to smooth over another aunt's public complaint about teenage years spent without proper matchmaking. Zhangyi Park was full of couples and umbrellas and the soft clink of spoons against cups. Humiliation had calories. It fed on the quiet judgments that multiplied with each glance. "I like my work," Yi said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She could list awards, publications, the name of the institute where she'd once won an innovation prize, but the words came out smaller, muffled by the polished teeth of polite ridicule. "You do, huh?" the man said, with a smile that did not include his eyes. "Well, wives should earn well. That's practical." The older woman tutted, and Yi could feel the room shrink. She pictured the evening ending with forced small talk and the taste of disappointment in her mouth. Again, when the check came, she reached with both hands naturally, because that's what she had been taught. "Take responsibility for your own table." The man stopped her with a single hand on the bill. "Let's go somewhere quieter," he suggested. His voice was low, the words delivered like a secret that offered a quick fix to social wounds. She should have left then. She did not. At the end of the night, at a small penguin print reception hall attached to the cousin's apartment, the air was heavy with incense and other people's expectations. A few relatives had drifted in, the sort who could notarize gossip and staple it into the family ledger. The man, the one who'd called her work inadequate, had his own problems to hush. He spoke fast, a word for her, a joke for the aunt, and then, with the audacity of those who have practiced improvisation, he said, "Marry me." It was nonsense, it was a dare, it was a sentence wrapped in laughter. He said, "1 year, no cohabitation, no claims to my bank account, sign here, it will quiet them. You get the respect, I get the appearance." Everyone laughed at first. A few seconds later, everyone stopped laughing. Yi found herself staring at a blank piece of paper that looked, for reasons she could not explain, heavier than any contract she'd written in the lab. Her signature had become an exercise in surrealism. The man produced a pen as though he had prepared for this exact moment. He offered his name. It sounded ordinary, Chen Wei. It sounded like a man who had practiced being unremarkable. They wrote terms in a hurried scrawl. 1-year term, clauses about no joint assets, a penalty clause the relatives would chant about for years, a modest sum, absurdly low in legal fiction, designed to terrify gossip into silence. There was champagne because someone always thought champagne helped marriages look legitimate in a hurry. There were photos. A cousin's camera flashed, and Yi posed between relatives, between the man who would be her temporary shield and the nervous laughter that followed. Later, in the taxi ride home, Yi pressed the paper to her chest like an errant prayer. It was absurd and perfect, a tiny fortress against faces that evaluated and discarded. She slept on the edge of that absurdity. Her mind held snippets, her father's pragmatic text about "do what's necessary," the cousin's triumphant "you showed them," the man's hand that had rested casually at the small of her back as if he already owned the geography of her. In the quiet of her apartment, the handbag sat on the floor like a small witness, its threadbare strap a proof that sometimes dignity and poverty walked hand in hand. If you want to see what a single signature can change, stay with this story. The twist comes by morning. The night's bargain was supposed to feel like a secret, a temporary patch. Instead, morning arrived with a headline that took the patch and turned it into daylight. Her phone vibrated against the bedside table, a group chat ping, a shared article. She squinted at the notification, a press release rolling across half the news feeds, an inauguration photo of a man stepping out from behind velvet rope, handsomely suited, the posture of someone built for ceremony. The caption named him Li Wangchuan, newly appointed CEO of the Wangchuan Group. Her heart did something odd and clumsy. Li Wangchuan was a name she'd seen in the margins of newspapers before. Chairman's son, heir apparent, a figure at charity galas, the kind of name that carried quiet alarms in certain family circles. The article said more than his title. A visual timeline of a man groomed for ownership, a biography in small bullets, Harvard, the founding of a tech incubator, a rumored stake in biomedical acquisitions. The photo showed him smiling at the crowd, an umbrella of media flashes haloing his head. At his feet, a woman in a pale dress clutched a bouquet. Mrs. Li, the caption called her. She flipped back through the night's photos with the reckless speed of someone trying to find a mistake. There he was, the man who had been Chen Wei on the cousin's camera, his posture in the awkward champagne photo the same. The name on the contract, the unremarkable scratch of his signature, suddenly did not belong to the small, ordinary man she'd met. Someone in the family chat had already made the connection and posted the cropped photo. Li Wangchuan's face pasted next to Chen Wei's signature. Emojis exploded like tiny verdicts. Yi's mother rang immediately. "You must come to my neighbor's house," she said, breathless, then practical. "They will bring cake. The neighborhood will be buzzing. Your aunt has already called everyone. Be there." On the way, neighbors nodded with the terrible intimacy that only a small community could afford. Someone whispered, "Mrs. Li, isn't that something?" And it sounded less like congratulations than an evaluation. The wedding photo, if it could be called that, morphed into something public. The cousin posted a congratulatory note that tasted of triumph. Within hours, Yi's name floated out of the private channel it had occupied and into a public soup of speculation. The man on the couch with the perfect jawline had never seemed like a man with two worlds to straddle. Yet by morning there were two lines of sight. The man who offered to quietly buy her a year of dignity, and the man in the glossy magazine photo whose smile was worth more than entire neighborhoods. Li Wangchuan arrived at his inauguration with a deliberate swagger. Reporters lined the steps, hands combing for sound bites. The boardroom had been dressed like a stage, orchids on the table, the company logo looming like a banner in the background. When he stepped forward to speak, cameras angled, flashes stitched together into a live fabric. He spoke of strategy and responsibility in a tone perfect for press. He used phrases like stakeholder value and ethical partnership, and his voice filled the room. Then the cameras turned, and his eyes landed on the woman standing in the back, who had not planned to appear that morning, and the moment became oddly smaller, private within the public theater. A cousin shouted his congratulations. Aunts elbowed their way through to touch the sleeve of his coat. Someone from Yi's neighborhood recorded a video and posted it with the caption, "From the street to the suite." The social ripple ran wide and merciless. Where, a few hours before, Yi had been merely humiliated, she now represented a narrative that everyone wanted to interpret. The poor researcher who had been plucked by fate, or by a CEO's whim. Work became a theater with a new intrusive audience. On the subway, people stared. Her colleagues sent messages with the rapid respect of predators calculating a new shelf label. The office murmured. Ning Wan, with her nails that glinted like tiny verdicts, slid over a paper cup of coffee and smiled with the practiced warmth of morning anchors. "You're trending," Ning said, not unkindly. Jin Yun's laugh followed, warm for the gossip, colder for the implication. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Li?" Yi's smile was a small, tight thing. "Awkward," she said. "I signed up. Look, it was a gossip bail thing, nothing more." Jiang Lingshuan watched from across the lab doorway with a tilt of her head that said experience and conquest. She had that polished confidence that came from Cambridge halls and an older economy of privilege. Her return to the company last year had been framed as expertise. Everyone admired the way she wore her achievements like tailored coats. Today, watching Yi, she offered a smile that could be folded into either congratulations or calculation. "You always pick the dramatic ways," Jiang said. "Congratulations." Ding Qiushui, meanwhile, stepped back into the lab like a shadow who had been waiting for light. He nodded, brief and formal. His stare was thin and distant, the kind a man uses to measure territory. He had been in the company long enough to understand hierarchies and resentments, dry enough to sniff when someone's social grit could complicate his plans. When he passed Yi a stack of papers, his fingers brushed hers for the barest second. An unremarkable contact, but the kind that left a reminder. "We have a meeting at 10:30, he said, voice flat. "Project status, be ready." The lab smelled of ethanol and the paper tang of research notebooks. Yi's bench was a small world: vials, a microscope with a bent light, a notebook where she had written the first sketch of an idea that had won her an award. She touched the edge of that notebook as if it were a talisman. The project she'd proposed was a niche therapy approach, not a miracle, not a cure, but a development designed to help stubborn wounds that refused to heal with conventional methods. She had spent years arguing for cautious trials, for rigorous monitoring, for ethics that weighed the patient's dignity as much as the data. "Your method isn't flashy," Director Huang had told her when she'd defended the proposal, "but it's necessary." Those words became her anchor. She explained the technique in plain language: an improved dressing that encouraged healthier tissue to grow, a combination of monitoring and gentle biological work, no sudden claims of curing everything. The department had given her access to a small cohort for a carefully monitored trial. For Yi, who had spent her life proving that competence could be louder than social standing, it was everything. That morning, before the meeting, she ran a quick test, checking a series of culture plates under the microscope: clear margins, neat colonies. For a second, the world was only the tiny, honest field of view in her lens. Small successes that meant nothing to gossip, but everything to her. Then, at 10:22, Li Wangchuan stepped through the lab door. He moved differently from the photos. The suit fitted him like a second skin, immaculate lines that suggested money could buy polish. But the man himself seemed to be measuring something at close range, a quiet curiosity rather than the cold entitlement Yi had imagined at the gala. He didn't shout, he didn't announce himself. He arrived at the threshold and observed, as if cataloguing a new species. For someone who'd been a stranger over champagne and a signature the night before, he had the habit of coming into rooms full of private light and making the air feel smaller. "Ms. Yi," he said. There was a softness in his voice that startled her. "You're here early?" "Yes," she answered, and then, because a lifetime of being small teaches you reflexes, she added, "You have a right to be here." He smiled faintly. "I have more than a right. I have a curiosity." Curiosity, Yi discovered, could be dangerously kind. Li's presence fused the lab air, cameras and whispers and 100 interpretations waiting outside the door. Director Huang appeared, buoyant with managerial smiles. "Mr. Li," he said, "we were just going over Xiaolu's preliminary results. Her approach has shown consistent patterns." Zhang's eyebrows rose like the polite flags of a person who had prepared for eventualities. "Impressive," she said. "I look forward to seeing the full report." The meeting moved into its formal cadence, boardroom tones polite, cameras kept at bay. Yi presented in the voice she had trained: factual, careful, refusal to dramatize. She testified to what had been done: the cohort size, the monitoring schedule, the cautious optimism that had tempered months of hard mornings. Questions came like polite pests. Someone asked about scalability, another about ethical oversight. There were nods. There were also notes typed with sharp keys, a few glances that were less about scientific curiosity and more about the story that now included her name. Li stayed for a portion, listening with a faint smile. Occasionally he would glance at the marriage certificate folded in her bag, a sliver of legal paper that no one else in the room acknowledged. His attention was not possessive, it was close and careful, like someone reading margins of a book he had not yet agreed to believe in. At lunch, the cafeteria rippled with whispers. A reporter's tweet had already minted a narrative. "Wang Chun's bride, love or strategy?" The headline read like a challenge. Ning Wan pushed back her hair and lowered her voice. "Say something glorious," she urged, half with encouragement, half because she wanted to see Yi trip. Yi sat with an apple and a little sandwich. She chewed slowly and watched the world orbit her like a bird that didn't realize she could set the path with a single beat of her wings. When Li appeared across from her, the wind shifted. "You handled the meeting well," he said, polite and not entirely casual. "Thank you," she said. "It's my work, that's all." He inclined his head. "Your work is your integrity. I know what that looks like." She almost laughed at his statement, at the way people now presented him as the man of gesture and words. "You don't know what it looks like, though," she said. "People keep changing the frame." He studied her. "Maybe I want to see it without the frames." There was something in his tone that suggested he was not entirely immune to the rumble and pull of public life. He had been born into it perhaps, but he had not been shaped into a person who saw the world exclusively through headlines. Whatever his reasons for offering a temporary marriage, they carried the weight of someone who understood what a name could do to a person. After work, a charity gala assembled like a small glittering storm. The Wang Chuan Group hosted philanthropists, board members, and socialites with many layers of appropriation. Li moved through the room with the ease of someone who had learned to be both observed and expected. Zhang glided too, in a manner that suggested she owned the language of power. They exchanged the kind of smiles that held back sharper words. For Yi, standing near the edges, the room felt performative and dangerous. She had, after all, never wanted the spotlight. She had wanted a good draft of her grant proposal and a little pocket of stability. Zhang crossed the room and stopped by Yi as if she had been meaning to do so all night. "So," Zhang said, a slow phrase, "how does it feel to be both a scientist and a symbol?" Yi watched Zhang name the discomfort that had lived inside her. "It's complicated," she admitted. "I prefer the lab." Zhang's eyes were soft for a second, observant, not cruel. "You could be more than a lab coat, Yi," she said. "You could navigate both worlds if you wanted to." There was something faintly predatory in the encouragement. Yi's cheeks burned, not from vanity, but from the raw exposure of having someone map your future like a real estate prospect. How many people, she wondered, wanted to attach themselves to her potential and not to her person. On the other side of the room, a small incident shifted the air. A waiter tripped, and the wine cascaded toward an embroidered gown. Li moved with a reaction so fast it looked almost rehearsed. He stepped forward and caught the glass in midair. The crowd applauded the drama of near disaster. For Yi, who had been watching from a distant corner, the motion was less spectacle and more a human recalibration. Here was a man who did not hesitate to rescue a falling thing. His fingers brushed the waiter's sleeve. His face was the picture of controlled calm. Later that night, a gossip column would caption the screenshot, "Chivalry or PR?" What they did not yet know was how private his gestures could be. The things he would do away from cameras, the ways he would sit on the edge of absurdly ordinary moments and watch other people live. He had reasons for the offer he had made in the cousin's living room, reasons that had nothing to do with romantic destiny and everything to do with a life built on contingency and a hunger for control. By the end of the evening, Yi had navigated congratulations, thin cautionary nods, and a handful of scheming smiles. The handbag, once a source of humiliation, held a new quiet power. The marriage certificate, folded just so, in its pocket, a legal shield, and a talisman against prying eyes. She could feel the small familiar weight of it as she walked home. A passerby whispered, "Mrs. Li," and the words sounded like a summons. Back at her apartment, she unpacked her bag and opened to the notebook where she kept results and reminders, the slow ledger of professional proof against the quick economy of society's judgments. She touched a page where she had scrawled the name of a patient who had been enrolled in the trial, a woman with a stubborn ulcer that had not healed in years. The project had been careful. The ethics committee had blessed it with conditions: stringent monitoring, standby antibiotics, immediate reporting of adverse events. Yi slept with the small certainty that work would keep her safe in the only way it always had, by making sense of chaos into data. The world outside, however, had a way of turning systems into stories. It took an incidental fact, a shared photo, and a few sentences that got retold until the truth was stretched thin. At 9 in the morning 2 days later, a call came in from a hospital 3 districts away. Yi's phone vibrated with the clinical ring she had learned to dread. The voice on the other end was tight with concern. "We have a participant from your trial who's showing an unusual infection," the nurse said. "Severe. We need to know details, protocol, recent changes." Her mind moved through checklists with the habitual serenity of someone trained to convert panic into process. "Which participant?" she asked. "What antibiotics have been given? When were the last dressing changes?" "Participant 3, the nurse said. They've been admitted. We're escalating. The words landed like a physical thing. On her desk, her notebook felt suddenly too small. I'll come, she said, and notify the ethics team. Her phone lit up with a dozen messages, some from anxious colleagues, others from people already itching for the drama. Ding's message was a single line, "Call me when you're free." Director Huang wanted a briefing at 9:30. PR ran damage scenarios by the minute. The company legal team, usually a distant calm, pinged her assistant for immediate documentation. At the same time, an internal chat thread in the Wang Chuan group lit up with images from hospital monitors. Headlines began to form in real time in the industry group. Cluster of infection reported in clinical trial. The phrasing could not have been clumsier if it tried. Words like cluster and trial and infection clicked together and began to sound like indictment. Lai read the messages as if watching a storm build on a screen. He rose from his office, sleeves walked back, and called Secretary Lin. Get the CCTV timestamps, he told her. Pull access logs for the lab for the last 72 hours. Notify me before anyone else outside the C-suite. His voice carried a command that was not mere executive muscle. It contained the urgency of someone who had the power to stop a rumor before it could devour a person. He did not call Yi first. He did not want to escalate emotions before he understood patterns. But he was preemptive in the only way he knew how, by making sure facts could be summoned to the table. Yi drove through a city that hummed with its day, thinking in lab-centered sentences, running through procedures and contingency plans. Her name was a drumbeat in her ears. Each ping of her phone was a reminder that science did not exist in a vacuum. It collided with headlines and shareholders and the fragile reputations of people who ate ordinary meals. At the hospital, fluorescent lights and clipped voices greeted her. A doctor in a white coat ushered her toward a curtained area where monitors blinked a rapid testimony of vital signs. The patient, Participant 3, was pale and asleep, and the dressing changes had been logged in a handwriting that was shaky in places. Yi read the notes and felt each concisely written item like a small knife. This looks serious, the attending physician said. We need to know if there were any protocol deviations. For patient safety, we have to inform the sponsor. She nodded. We will provide a full audit trail, she said. Inside, her heart worked at a different rhythm. Fear threaded with resolve. She could think of many ways to fail, but she could not imagine accepting failure without defending the truth of what she had done. Word spread quickly. The company's emergency group chat had been activated. PR drafted statements. Legal scrawled possible next steps in shorthand. Yi felt eyes on her, not unlike the cafes that first night. But those were scientific eyes now, records and questions, rather than the petty sort. Back at the Wangchuan Towers, a boardroom instinct took shape. Li arrived and observed the flicker of concern in Director Huang's face. Contain publicly, he said to a room already buzzing with mitigation strategies. We follow protocol. We do not rush to decisions. There was a carefulness in his tone that felt like a hand reaching for a fragile object. Who among us can vouch for the lab process? He asked. Who will stand in the room and present facts? Yi, summoned into that glass-walled arena, felt like an exposed nerve in a city siren. Cameras were kept outside. Internal eyes, however, had a way of feeling deeper. Colleagues shuffled papers. Ding took notes with the patient steadiness of someone who catalogued advantage. Zhang watched with eyes that read weather. Ms. Yi, Director Huang began, we appreciate your presence. We must act responsibly. Yi placed her notebook on the table, the notebook with patient initials and timestamps, and the small, clean handwriting of someone who measured everything twice. There have been no unsanctioned changes to the protocol, she said. All dressing changes were logged. We followed the ethics board's directives. The words traveled, then paused. Someone in the back, PR's deputy, tapped their phone and said, we should prepare a statement. We can say we're cooperating fully. Lai watched her during these exchanges with an expression that had a protective weight. He did not interrupt. His power was quieter, an ability to shift the course of the conversation by the small economy of his attention. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table as if to anchor the room. We will look at the data, he said. We will audit the access logs, the supply chain records, the lab's temperature logs. "We will not allow conjecture to replace evidence." The words calmed some people and alarmed others. In some corners, the shapes formed that a corporate leader was intervening to salvage its own image. For Yi, they sounded like a shield, and for someone whose life had been measured in the thin currency of other people's approval, the shield was something she had never expected to find. And yet, before proof could be collected and narratives corrected, something else made the air go cold: a whispered phone call from the hospital desk. "We've had a second admission," the nurse said. "Patient 4, similar symptoms." The room tightened, chairs scraped, the city outside seemed to stop for a half breath. Rumors are patient things, they live in silence and strike later. This was not yet a verdict, but it was the beginning of a throat clearing, a sign that stories would grow their teeth if not stopped. He kept her eyes on the notebook. The pages held the small, honest detail of a life dedicated to careful steps. Her marriage certificate, still folded in the corner of her bag, felt like a different kind of evidence now, not of love, but of how the world would narrate her life. As phones charged and people moved into action, something else uncoiled in the back of Yi's mind, the contract clause about reputation and penalties. In the hush that followed the nurse's update, it sounded less like a legal measure and more like a prophecy, words bought and sold when people feared loss of face. Ding folded his hands and looked at her. "We need to run a root cause analysis," he said. "We need to check every entry, every change, every vendor." Yi's fingers tightened around the corner of the notebook. "We will," she said. "We must." Outside, the city went on with its rumbling urgency. Buses whispered, a dog barked twice, a vendor shouted the price of fruit. Inside the boardroom, people spoke of protocols, ethics, and the fragile tissue of public trust. Lee excused himself for a moment and walked to the window. He watched the street below, and for the first time since the cousin's living room, something like vulnerability showed in the set of his mouth. He did not act as if he had all the answers. He acted as if, when necessary, he would gather them. The last sound before the room turned into a plan was a message chime on Yi's phone. It was a photo from a nurse. The culture plates, atypical growth in 2 samples. The image was small, clinical, and terrible. Ding's voice, when it came, was flat. "We're convening a triage team." He looked at Lee for a moment, something like anger or expectation in his eyes. "And Ms. Yi, you'll lead the internal documentation." There is courage that is quiet, and there is courage that is compelled. Yi folded her hands over the notebook and allowed the steady motion of her pen to anchor her. The world outside had decided to look closely. She had to be ready to meet it, with evidence and with truth. When she left the building that evening, the city felt different, the air charged as if a storm had begun somewhere beyond sight. Cameras, though kept at bay, had already begun to speculate. In a corner of the internet, someone asked, "Wasn't she Mrs. Lee a week ago?" That small, snide question curled into 100 uncertain threads. As she walked home, she felt the weight of the paper in her bag. The cheap handbag had been a symbol of ridicule. Now it carried the thin arc of her career and an unexpected marriage that had been meant to be a temporary shield. The lines between private and public had blurred. She did not know whether the shield would hold. She only knew she could not let the story be told by others without giving it her own facts. Behind her, in an office with a panoramic view, Lee looked at a string of messages. He clicked through logs, contacted Secretary Lin, and ordered the first round of access history pulls. He had seen many crises in print and had handled damage control before. This was not only a corporate contingency for him. For reasons he would not explain, he had made a choice in a cousin's living room and now watched the consequences slide toward a woman who had not asked for the spotlight. He would protect facts, he would collect evidence, he would, if it came to it, stand against the feeling that power equaled distance. Outside, the city breathed and moved. Inside Yi's bag, the notebook waited. The marriage certificate lay folded like a small silent pact. The lab's microscopes hummed into the night, and someone far away in a hospital rote-checked a monitor with the careful hands of a person who counts seconds for a living. The storm had only begun to gather. The city was quieter at night, or at least it pretended to be. Inside the Wangchuan Group's security room, Secretary Lin played video clips with the steady concentration of someone pulling apart a puzzle. Frames marched across the monitor. A timestamp here, a reflected light there, the blurred figure of a person hunched over a lab bench. She rewound, not because she wanted to, but because she had to see everything twice. No one trusts the first look when someone's career was on the line. "What about the power logs?" Li Wangchuan asked from the doorway, his voice close enough to keep Lin from flinching. He had the habit of showing up where work had narrowed to a single point of urgency. The soft glow of monitors painted him in grayscale. Even when he wore a suit, his sleeves were rolled as if he had just left a manual trade. When he watched screens, his face did not look like a man who merely issued orders. There was an impatience that something be done right. Lin clicked between files. There was a backup switch 3 nights ago. The UPS shows a short interval where the main feed dropped and then came back. The system accepted a manual override with an internal credential. Li's eyes narrowed. Whose credential? Badge ID 0459, Lin said. Assigned to Ding Q Shui. Outside the security room, fluorescent lights hummed through the corridor. Rooms on other floors had their own worries. Marketing slinging drafts of careful statements, legal scribbling red lines on crisis scripts. But here, in the dim, a name settled like a weight in the air. Ding Q Shui, lab manager, veteran of the bench, man of precise hands. If his badge had been used during the window where cold storage could have been vulnerable, that was a thread that would, when pulled, begin to unravel more than one assumption. Li rubbed his temple. Pull the access logs for the lab door from the last week. Cross-reference with after-hours entries to the cold room and the shipments recorded against stored samples. Lin's fingers flew. Her training at Wangchuan had been in order. They liked people who could make chaos legible. Within an hour, she produced a small orchestra of evidence. The door access sequence, export logs that showed a discrepancy between the recorded temperature of a storage unit and the manual log, and an invoice list where one box had been signed as received but not scanned through the chain of custody scanner. Lai watched the items appear on the screen, his jaw tightening in a way Yi had seen once before, when he'd watched a charity auction and mentally catalogued what to bid on. "Bring me CCTV from the corridor near the cold room for those timestamps," he said. "And get me the sample transport manifest. Every signature, every transfer." When Yi heard that Li had requested footage, she felt 2 things at once, a small buoyant relief and the faintest prickle of fear. Relief because, after the clinic's phone call and the boardroom's gravity, someone in power had decided to look for facts. Fear because facts could be blunt and unforgiving. If there were errors in the lab, she wanted to know them before anyone else decided to frame her. She walked the lab with its familiar smells and light. It had been a temporary refuge during the nights she'd run late, the place where she told herself her life made sense. Now it felt almost theatrical, like a stage set waiting for actors to make their claims. Her notebook lay open at her bench, timestamps, patient codes, syringe lot numbers, every dressing change logged. She watched her handwriting, the way certain letters tipped in a hurry. Everything she could present was there, honest and small. Lin called her into the security room. The footage rolled. There was a late-night janitor, a courier, then, just before 1 in the morning, a hurried silhouette that moved with quick, practiced efficiency. The camera angle hid the face, but shoulders were broad and the gait familiar to anyone who'd watched 1,000 lab techs at shift change. Lin slowed the footage frame by frame. In the reflected glass pan there was a flash, a badge clipped to a belt. "Enhance," Li said softly. They could make out the curve of the badge and the midline number. It matched the ID Lin had already found. A hand placed a small nondescript box on a cart. A second later, the footage skipped. An editing telltale someone had tried to conceal. But the security system had a redundant frame buffer, and Lin pulled from the overflow. There it was again. The same person, the same box, and the way his shoulders hunched, almost apologetic, as he closed the cold room and left. Ding Q Shui passed through the lab in the daylight like a fixed weather. At night, he carried a different weight. The evidence would not paint him as a cartoon villain. It painted him as a person who had chosen a method. One late entrance, an override code, a manual edit to records. His movements were not panicked. They were precise, which suggested premeditation. Yi felt like someone reading the margins of her life. She said nothing, because she had nothing to add beyond what the notebook said. Facts were cruel and clean. If they showed that someone with access had come in after hours, and that the cold chain had been interrupted during that window, then there was a case. Li did not call the press. He did not make broad statements. He convened a small team, Secretary Lin, the head of compliance, a forensic IT analyst, and Yi. "We find the facts first," he said. "We don't let this leak." They worked through the night, a machine of individuals bound by urgency. Lin discovered that a maintenance override had been entered from a terminal registered to Ding's phone. The forensic analyst showed metadata. A file had been altered in the lab's inventory system, its edit time not matching the server time. Someone had changed a log to hide a transfer. Ding received a call just before dawn. He arrived at the lab with the same outward calm of a man who had practiced keeping his face neutral. "What's the matter?" he asked when Li met him at the bench. Cameras had been called in. The glass-walled lab looked like a legal theater. Li did not raise his voice. "You worked late Wednesday," he said. "We have CCTV showing you entering the cold room. We have a manual override logged to your badge. We also have an edit to the inventory record at 1:22 with your login." Ding's jaw tightened. His hands, large and familiar, closed into small fists. "I fixed a cooling alert," he said. "Late-night sensor misreads happen. I stayed to make sure it didn't affect the samples." "Why would you edit the inventory file?" Lin asked. Ding looked at Lin as if he had been insulted by the accusation. "Because the scanner was down," he said. "I documented the transfer so the chain of custody wasn't broken." Li folded his hands. "Why was the scanner down only on that night? Why does the file show a manual change made after the entry time? Why was there a secondary power cycle timed with the edit?" Ding's reply was a hurricane of small, bitter sentences. "The scanner has been glitchy for months. We flagged it. I fixed another cooling alarm in Building C last year. We used manual logs then. He stopped. His face creased. It was not the face of someone who expected grace. "You have me in here like a criminal." "You're under investigation," Li said. "Until we know more, you will have limited access to the lab. We'll place you on administrative leave if necessary." Ding's reaction cut through the room. Anger, humiliation, and a precise cold sense of betrayal. "Administrative leave?" He laughed, a brittle sound. "And who marches on me then? Who will believe I—" Li's eyes were steady. "We all find out, or we all make assumptions. I don't want either. But if someone tampers with a trial, it's a matter for compliance and ethics. You understand that, Ding? You've been here long enough." When Ding walked out, he did not slam a door. He walked like a man who had been stripped of small comforts. His authority, the sanctity of his shift, the confidence that had allowed him to micromanage the lab for years. He had been careful enough to make a mistake that could be misread as intent. There were other ways to be hurt aside from being falsely accused. Ding's face showed all of them. News did not stay inside a room for long. Someone on a different floor, an irritable junior manager, had noticed the visible tension and taken a call with an industry contact. Rumor, with the life of a small animal, escaped the building's careful controls. Overnight, the company drafted a statement acknowledging an internal incident and promising full cooperation with investigators. No names were mentioned. The press smelled blood in the water. Yi slept badly that night, a thin, exhausted sleep where her mind catalogued lines of code rather than dreams. She woke to 100 unread messages, supportive notes from a professor overseas, ambivalent congratulations from distant relatives, ugly speculation from strangers. The phone became a hub of weather. She wished she could make people understand that she had not gone out of her way to court headlines. She had signed a thin legal sheet to quiet gossip. The rest had been the city's doing. The hearing came 3 days later, a formal internal review with compliance officers, legal counsel, and a rotating panel of board members who watched like appellate judges. Yi was not forced into it as a spectacle. This was process. She presented her notebook, the typed logs, the patient records, the sequence of automated backups that matched her entries. The ethics chair listened with the polite, professional face of someone used to making difficult calls. Li stood to one side, quiet, a man who had the power to shape the outcome but chose instead to let evidence speak. Within the hearing, things moved like a court scene in miniature. PR's deputy recommended a quick separation from the trial lead to look responsible. A head of legal suggested a cautious public posture that read like code for scapegoat. Ms. Yi, the legal counsel said, matching the formality of the room. We may need to suspend the trial pending a forensic review. For the sake of the company's obligation to participants, we must take measured steps. Yi listened. She did not plead innocence in the way a victim might. She brought what she had: pages, numbers, patient consent forms, photos of dressings themselves. If there was a deviation, show me where, she said. I will correct it, but don't make me the story without the facts. The man in the center of the room, Director Huang, moved like a man navigating scalloped expectations. The company must be proactive. We must reassure stakeholders. Li leaned forward. We will not rush to conclusions, he said. We will run forensics. We will share results with the ethics committee and the participants' families. I will personally oversee the investigative team. His intervention shifted the room. It did not make people kinder, but it made them careful. There was a difference between being the one who averts a scandal and the one who blurts out a headline. Li chose the former. That choice would matter. The forensic IT analyst released more data. The inventory edit timestamps had been altered from 2 terminals, one of which carried Ding's login. The manual override had been keyed from a terminal whose IP address matched a maintenance laptop registered to the facilities department but used on that night by a subcontractor. The chain of custody log had been stamped as received without a scan because the scanner had been indeed offline. Yet the scanner's system showed a recent firmware update timestamped suspiciously close to the time of the incident. Someone had used other means to hide an action. It was like watching the sketch of a scandal materialize. Ding, who had been restrained from the lab, now sat on the edge of a room filled with neutral chairs. He was quiet and small in the way older men sometimes become when the world strips away the trappings that kept them safe. I didn't mean for anyone to be hurt, he said when someone asked. I was protecting our samples. They had been failing because of shipment delays. I was trying to stop that, not start something worse. Did you touch the patient's samples? The ethics chair asked. Ding's eyes darkened. I transferred some samples to a temporary storage that I thought would be safe. I entered the transfer into the manual logs because the scanner was down. I would never intentionally introduce contamination. Then defiant, he added, and I am tired of being told the old ways are obsolete when my team runs on experience. The forensic team had an answer for the manual log claim. The transferred samples were recorded, but the temperature logs for the unit used were inconsistent with long-term storage. In one case, the temperature rose briefly, a fluctuation that could permit microbial growth. Whether that rise alone caused the infections was not certain. Infections crop up from clusters of causes. But the fact that someone had accessed the cold storage after hours and manually edited logs was enough to create plausible grounds for investigation. Outside the hearing room, journalists called. Someone leaked a redacted memo suggesting procedural lapses, and an industry blog wrote headlines that used the words trial complication and lead investigator implicated. Yi's inbox filled with pleas from family members and messages from patients' families seeking answers. She sat at her bench and took a long breath. She had expected obstacles. She had not expected the speed at which rumor could harden into presumption. Li visited her that evening, finding her under the fluorescence of a lab that no longer felt wholly hers. He did not come with a camera crew or an entourage. He came with a thermal mug of coffee and the look of someone who had run a personal marathon of sorting evidence. I know this is wrong, he said simply. She looked up. I know I haven't been flawless, Yi admitted, but I didn't do this. He sat a cautious distance away. I believe you, he said. We will show it. How did you? Yi began, suddenly needing to know who he was when no one was looking. He smiled faintly. Because I can pull things other people can't. But I didn't do it to use power. I did it because facts should outweigh gossip. She opened her mouth and then closed it, because the conversation felt like walking onto a narrow bridge. Why did you offer me the temporary marriage? She asked, an honesty that had nothing to do with the hearing and everything to do with quiet rooms. Li's eyes softened. Because my grandmother used to say the world is kinder to a name, he said. And because I'd seen how people like us get boxed and priced, I wanted to buy you just a year of peace. It was clumsy and not my finest idea. I didn't imagine it would turn a whisper into a headline. How do you live with being both the solution and the problem? She asked. He laughed, a small, rueful sound. I don't always. Right now I will be whatever helps you get through this. They spoke that night about small, unimportant things, how the lab kept stray post-it notes, how a patient named Leon had made an offhand joke during a home visit. Their conversation was simple and human, and for a sliver of time it made the greater noise feel distant. The forensic review widened. Secretary Lin found a discrepancy in the vendor manifest. A box of sterile dressings had been logged as shipped, but not scanned upon arrival. The delivery signatures matched a subcontractor who sometimes worked nights. Lee's team traced the subcontractor's route and found that the delivery driver had been rerouted through a maintenance corridor near the lab, a route used for internal transfers that bypassed normal scanning points. Why a delivery had been allowed that route at night raised more questions. As the net of evidence tightened, another piece emerged. A backup camera outside the service door of the building captured a van idling at 1 a.m, its driver looking at his phone, then hunching beneath the van's top for a moment before walking toward the corridor. The van's license plate was partially obscured, but a forensic enhancement matched the partial plate to a vehicle rented under an account used for event logistics tied to a mid-level PR coordinator, someone who had access to personnel rosters, and, crucially, who had been seen the week prior arguing quietly with Ding about the primacy of protocol. Lee did not relish the discovery. The involvement of an in-house coordinator meant the possibility of factional politics, the very thing Yi had feared and Director Huang had silently acknowledged. When Lin cross-checked emails, she found a string of terse messages between Ding and a junior coordinator that spoke of pressures and needing to make a point. The messages were not direct admissions, they were the brittle, evasive language of people pushed to edges, but they were enough to build a pattern. When the board called a meeting to review the evidence, they called the journalists in the outer room and asked them to wait. The company would make no public move before the evidence was clear. Inside, the atmosphere was as close to theatrical as these proceedings ever got. Polished chairs, long tablets of glass, a quiet tension distilled by the low hum of air vents. Lee presented the timeline. He had Secretary Lin show CCTV sequences side by side with access logs, annotated and cross-referenced. He had the forensic analyst present the metadata. He had Yi's lab notebook scanned and displayed, pages side by side with system logs. The presentation moved like the careful unspooling of a spool of film, frames appearing, then clarifying one another. When the relevant clips rolled, there was a small audible intake in the room. The footage did not make a drama of anyone's face, it showed a pattern of actions. The press coordinator used an access card at an odd hour to exit near the delivery bay. A vehicle not scheduled for sample transport used a route that bypassed the scanner. Ding's badge opened the cold room shortly afterward. An edit to the inventory file glossed over the manual transfer. A firmware update had been pressed through by someone on night duty who had left traces. Ding's defense had been that he was a man saving samples. The evidence suggested a different motive. Someone had orchestrated a way to make certain samples vulnerable to temperature variation, and then had obscured the movement enough to create plausible deniability. Whether their intent was to sabotage a trial or to create a spectacle to draw attention to complaints about supply chains, no one would be able to conclude with certainty in that room. But the pattern amounted to deliberate obstruction of protocol. Director Huang, who had been wary of headlines from the start, folded his hands. "We will not let this become about one person's dignity," he said. "If there was wrongdoing, we will correct it, but we also must be fair." PR drafted the company's statement with exacting patience. The clinical trial had experienced an adverse event. The company had launched an internal investigation. The company would cooperate fully and would implement immediate procedural changes. No name appeared, but in the hours after the meeting, PR quietly informed the families of the trial participants of the steps being taken, and the ethics chair called for independent external auditors to review the process. In the press room outside, a reporter raised a hand. "Will Miss Yi be suspended?" Lee's answer was measured. "We will not make personnel decisions until the investigation is complete. We will not allow speculation to override process. That sentence was a small victory for Yi. It would not erase the rumors, but it kept the company from the simpler temptation to tidy the scandal by throwing someone out the door. The investigators continued. Lin's tenacity pulled at a final thread. The subcontractor's route led to a storage locker rented by a temp worker who had been dismissed months earlier after a series of petty infractions. The temp testified that he had been contacted by a man who promised cash to move certain packages at odd hours. The man had used a nickname. The temp had been handed an envelope and told to forget the details. This was where motive frayed. Who paid the temp to reroute a shipment? Who would benefit from a trial's complications? The answer did not point to an obvious corporate benefactor. Instead, it began to suggest small jealousies and fears. A manager who felt cornered. A project that threatened to move budgets and attention away from entrenched teams. Ding cracked in a follow-up interview with investigators. He admitted to moving samples to what he called temporary safe storage, because he feared that a failed cold chain would make his team look bad. His words were not simple admissions of sabotage. They were a confession shaped by resentment and fear. Fear of obsolescence, fear of being overshadowed by a young woman who had suddenly become both a scientist and a symbol. They started treating me like a relic, he said. They would talk of new protocols and how I should retire. I thought I could show them we were needed, that what we had always done could still work. You tampered with storage? The investigator asked. Ding's voice broke. I moved them. I changed the log so it would appear we had done the transfer properly. I didn't want anyone's career ruined, especially not mine. I wasn't thinking about risk like that. I only saw my team, my history. Li listened, quietly, as if cataloging the shape of a wound. He caught Yi's eye across the room. She looked tired and not quite whole, as if threads had been pulled from a sweater. There was ache in her expression, but also a clarity that had nothing to do with headlines. She had defended a process because she believed in it. She had not anticipated that someone's fear would lock the door behind them. Ding's consequences were decided without melodrama. The board recommended disciplinary action, administrative leave pending review, transfer to a role with no access to samples, and mandatory retraining in protocol. The language was careful. It had to be. Corporate decisions must balance justice, reputations, and legal caution. Ding left the hearing with a small shuddered apology to Yi. I'm sorry for what happened, he said, voice raw. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. You hurt the people who trusted you, Yi said quietly. That's real. It was not revenge. It was an attempt to hold accountable without spectacle. Yi did not want to see Ding destroyed. She wanted the safety of future patients assured and the integrity of the science restored. The PR statement that followed was factual and restrained. It spoke of an internal incident, an investigation, and immediate reforms to chain of custody and vendor management. It stated that the company would work with regulators and external auditors. It said, crucially for Yi's life, that the company recognized no evidence of fraud attributed to the lead investigator. The phrasing was careful, the impact enormous. The industry blinked. Celebrities moved on. The social currents that had once carried mockery shifted away like a tide. When the black cloud cleared enough for stronger light to pass, the trial was restarted under a stricter protocol, a third-party monitor, increased documentation, external validation of cold chain logistics. Yi led the process changes with a meticulousness that made people respect, rather than merely notice her. She rewrote the SOPs for the trial, added photographic documentation of each sample transfer, and instituted a redundant logging system that made covert edits far harder. At the first follow-up meeting with the external auditors, Yi stood before a room of scientists and regulators and presented the changes she had implemented. Her voice was calm, and her slides avoided hyperbole. She showed the initial data in cautious tones, emphasizing the ethical steps and the watchfulness of the monitoring. There were no celebratory exclamations when a patient's wound showed early signs of healthy granulation. There were careful notes and measured hope. The auditors nodded. The trial continued. It was not a crystal-clear victory. The therapy did not cure everything overnight, but the first set of restarted patients showed progress where previously there had been stagnation. That progress, measured in small literal ways, less drainage, less swelling, Tissue beginning to knit was the sort of thing that, in science, prompts more data collection rather than headlines. For Yi, it was a sober reassurance that her work could speak for itself when given a fair chance. During the weeks that followed, Yi and Li's relationship grew into a new shape. It did not skip toward melodrama, it shifted into the slow, real work of two people who had been pulled into the same orbit. He would visit the lab with a thermos of coffee and sit at the window, reading grant applications, or quietly taking notes on patient welfare. She would show him the small joys of the bench, the way a microscope stage could be coaxed to reveal a new pattern, the small thrill of a duplicable result. They argued once, quietly, heatedly, about the nature of privacy and the right to choose a life without press intrusion. Li apologized, not with grand statements, but with adjustments. Fewer public appearances together, clearer boundaries for family. He admitted, acted impulsively in the cousin's living room. "I should have asked you first," he said. "I didn't give you the dignity of a choice." She accepted the apology in her way, a short, honest thing that had the sound of someone who forgave and expected better. "I signed a paper thinking it would buy me silence," she said. "But the world trades in louder currencies. If we decide to be together, let it be because we choose it, not because paper tells us so." He listened. And then, one small evening after the auditor's approval had come through and the trial was back on stable ground, Li sat across from her at a small table in her kitchen. The cheap handbag lay on a chair like an old companion. The marriage certificate was in a drawer in his office. He reached across and took her hand, the same small gesture he'd made in the cousin's living room, but now no longer a ruse. "I don't want a year," he said. "I don't want a contract. I want to be here because I want to, not because I offered a fake shelter." Yi looked at him, a smile playing like relief. "What if I don't want more notoriety? What if I want the work?" "I want the work too," he said. "I want both. I want the equation to be us plus lab plus life. I'll change the terms. No penalty clause, no charade. I'll write something that says something true." He wrote a short note there on a scrap of paper, handwriting not as practiced as his corporate signatures but steady. It said nothing about ownership and everything about intention. A promise to support without control, to listen without presumption. He crossed out the penalty clause on the original contract and slid the paper to her. "Choose," he said simply. She took the paper, read it, and folded it. The gesture was both symbolic and earnest. It was not a legal filing, but a seed planted. She kept the cheap handbag. She framed the marriage certificate, not as proof of convenience, but as a reminder of how fragile decisions could become meaningful if tended. Their small private ceremony of intention was not broadcast. They went to a court clerk's office only to file a simple amendment to the contract. No penalties, and a clause that recognized mutual respect and autonomy. They did not invite the press. A junior colleague took a photo because the moment felt like a small victory for two people who had been tested. Word in the company shifted. Zhang Lingxuan, who had been cool and distant during the crisis, approached Yi in the hallway one afternoon. The Cambridge Polish still sat on her voice, but there was an honesty there now. "You handled yourself well," she said. "And I was wrong to assume you wanted the limelight. I thought—" She stopped, choosing her words. "I thought the world would open for you and you would forget where you came from. I overread the situation." Yi studied Zhang. "You worried because someone else took up space," she said. "We all worry about seats at the table." Zhang nodded, the tension easing from her shoulders. "If you want, I can help with the next grant application," she offered. Not as an ally in the public eye, but as someone with the same interests. It was not a grand reconciliation. It was the practical exchange of expertise between two professionals who had learned how fragile reputations could be and how quick alliances were worth forging. Ning Wan and Jin Yun, who had been at the edges of gossip, learned to be quieter. Professional courtesy resumed its measured rhythm. At a small company symposium where Yi presented the trial's revised methods, Li sat in the front row, not to guard or to own but to watch. She stood behind the podium with a calmness that belonged to someone who had been given the chance to speak after being shouted at. Her slides were understated. She focused on ethics, monitoring, and the human responsibility behind data. The room was full of colleagues, patients' family members, and a few wary journalists. When she finished, the applause felt like a measurement, not of celebrity, but of competence. After the session, a patient from the trial approached her. The woman's wound had shrunk. Before she left, she squeezed Yi's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up." Yi felt something like a rightness settle into her chest. It was not fame. It was the quiet fact that a life of small, steady work could hold meaning beyond the verdict of strangers. Li and Yi had their share of ordinary domesticities. They learned each other's coffee orders. He began attending patient family meetings not because of image, but because he wanted to listen. She started bringing him to lab floor celebrations, not to be shown off, but because she wanted the company of someone who had learned to sit in silence and be present. Together they reclaimed the handbag and the certificate as relics of a battle they had both endured. The handbag, refreshed with a small leather repair, became a symbol, not of poverty, but of resilience. There were still strains. A columnist wrote a piece implying that power still protected people, and supporters on both sides took sides online. There were difficult meetings with legal advisors about how to balance transparency and privacy. But the tenor of those fights felt different, less like a raw, unforgiving tide, and more like a series of managerial decisions about how best to protect participants and staff. Ding, meanwhile, received his transfer. He was not left to a fate of ruin. He was reassigned to a role where he could retrain and, if he chose, rebuild. Yi had insisted on a path that combined accountability and the possibility of redemption. "People make mistakes," she said to the compliance team. "But we also have an obligation to the team's future. We can't be cruel when we should be corrective." Over time, the trial's data accumulated. It was cautious, ethical, and quietly hopeful. There were patients who found a measure of relief. There were setbacks that required revisiting methods and adjusting protocols. That is how science moved, incrementally, with a humility that newspapers rarely celebrated. A year after the cousins' living room negotiation, the anniversary arrived like a soft drumbeat rather than a headline. Yi sat at her bench and opened her notebook, finding an entry she'd made the day she had signed the contract. She read the line and smiled at the awkwardness of her younger voice. There was, in the drawer where she kept her lab certificates and patient files, a small ribbon tied to the marriage certificate she and Li had amended. She left it there, not hidden, because it reminded her of how fragile reputations could be tended into something more honest. Li came by that afternoon, hands in his pockets. "Do you remember the bag?" he asked. She held it up. It was the same worn thing, its strap repaired with a new stitch. "It's my talisman," Yi said. "It has dignity built into the seams." They walked to the company garden, a small terrace with potted plants and a view of the skyline. There, people occasionally took calls and made decisions with a seriousness that only skyscraper can impose. The couple sat on a bench, side by side, the city's hum a distant orchestra. "We did not get a fairy tale rescue," Li said, turning to her. "We got a messy, complicated process that required people to be honest and brave. I'm glad I didn't run away." "You didn't, because you could have," she replied. "You stayed." He took her hand, the same small grip that had moved from politics to partnership. "I want to stay," he said, "not because of what it implies publicly, but because of what it means privately. Will you stay with me? Not because of a contract, but because you want to." She looked out over the city, the place that had first humiliated her, then reshaped her life. She thought of her mother's practical voice, of Patient's small, grateful hands, of a lab bench that had become an altar to persistent detail. She turned back to Li. "Yes," she said, "I will stay, but it's not because of the name, it's because of who stands beside me." He smiled, a real one now, softer and more open than the photos had ever captured. They sealed the promise with something quieter than a public gesture, the small, private exchange of keys to their lives. They were not immune to future storms, but they had learned how to gather facts and how to anchor one another when the tide threatened to rise. The company instituted reforms beyond the trial, a moratorium on unilateral overrides, mandatory third-party verification for high-stakes transfers, and a refresh of vendor management. The companions to those reforms were speeches and training sessions, and a new appreciation that science and reputation must be stewarded together. For Yi, whose life had always hinged on careful steps, the company's new policies felt like a validation of the ethic she had pursued all along. There was a closing scene that meant more to her than any headline, an afternoon where a small patient celebration took place in a community center, balloons, flowers, and families clustered in chairs. Yi stood beside Li as they watched a patient who had participated in the trial clap for a small symbolic milestone. Less drainage, more mobility. The crowd was modest, warm, and human. Photographers were present but kept at respectful distance because PR had issued clear guidelines about sensitive patient privacy. After the small ceremony, the patient's mother hugged Yi. "You gave us hope," she said, "not the kind the media writes about, but the kind you measure in days." Yi felt speechless in the best possible way. "Then we did our job," she said. "We'll keep doing it." Li stood behind her, hand on the small of her back, the gesture of proximity that once had been an impulsive comfort now shaped into steady support. They had walked through gossip and sabotage and the brittle machinery of corporate defense. They had found a way to convert a bargain into something honest. In the quiet that followed the crowd's dispersal, Yi pulled her notebook from her bag. She wrote a line at the top of a fresh page. "Integrity in work, integrity in life." She closed the book and slid it back into the patched handbag. They walked out into the sun. The city, which had once seemed to delight in her humiliation, now felt like a place that could hold her successes. A neighbor waved from across the street, and this time the wave had no edge of sharp curiosity, only the ordinary warmth of someone who recognized a face that had endured. At home that evening, Li produced the original contract and a new scrap of paper. He did not announce it with ceremony. He simply asked, "Will you keep this with me? As evidence that we chose differently." She took the paper and, with a quiet laugh, framed both the old contract and the new note, placing them on a small shelf among lab mementos and patient thank you notes. The framed pieces sat there as artifacts of a life that had been turbulent and then steadied, a study in how choices and evidence could change outcomes. When the company released its annual report, Yi's project was featured not as a miracle, but as an example of ethical tenacity, a program that had learned the hard lesson of procedural vigilance. Investors' nods were measured, headlines cautious. But the families who mattered knew the truth, that science had to be patient and people had to be careful. At night, when the city lights stitched the skyline into a constellation, Yi and Li would sometimes sit by the window and talk about small things. They argued about whether they should plant herbs on their balcony, whether they would host a quiet dinner for colleagues, or where to store the extra keys. These conversations were ordinary and intimate, and to Yi, a miracle of a different sort. She kept the handbag near her lab coat. Its repaired strap had become a small emblem of persistence. The marriage certificate, now framed between a patient photo and a laboratory award, looked less like an instrument of convenience and more like a chronicle of two people who had learned to bear witness to the messy arithmetic of human life. When the next chapter of the company's work came, new trials, cautious pilots, and another set of reform measures, Yi was ready, her name no longer a headline, but a reputation forged by competence and generosity. Li walked alongside, not as an owner of her narrative, but as a partner who had learned to gather evidence before making decisions that affected others' lives. They had, in the end, turned a moment of shame into a season of shared stewardship. The betrayed bride became, through the slow work of truth and partnership, an improbable exemplar, a woman who managed to keep her dignity while insisting upon process, a man who learned to translate power into protection rather than possession. The city continued to gossip and forget, but the small, important things endured. The patient's healthy gait, the corrected log that would prevent future errors, the lunch they would share on the terrace where, once, they had traded uncertainty for a promise. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and watch the next chapter.